I think that we should reply to the previous statement, Mr. Manuel Sotomayor. Mr. Πώς είσαι, Έλενα? Τι κάνετε? Γεια σε όλους.
No, I can't. I was seeing you through the live feed, but I cut it off in order to get better communication.
I see. Okay, well then I'm sitting down again. Manuel, I would like, first of all, to welcome you personally, because you accepted to get out of your summer vacations. It's summer in Peru today, and yesterday, and 3 months since December. To come and share with us your experience, your personal experience of how Peru was before the reforms and how Peru is after the reforms. It is very telling for us because although we are a small country that knows everything about everybody, we tend to also be a small country that is very many times isolated from the world. And we do hear about Latin America, but we would like to really hear from somebody that actually lives there and tell us their story from the inside. And I'd like to introduce you to our moderator, Ms. Penelope Gavras, who is a fine, extraordinary journalist in Greece. And on our panel, we have Ruth Richardson, our former Minister of Finance of New Zealand, the lady that came a lot to your country and helped the reforms. And we also have on our panel Gary Reid, former World Bank specialist on public sector reform, and Panagiotis Karkatsoulas. It's incredible. I can say the English last names, but not the Greek last names. And who is an extraordinary public servant, public sector specialist, and has been awarded the leading award of public service in the international spectrum. So here we go. Manuel, the floor is yours.
Yes. Let me ask you one simple question. I sent you a video. Has it been shown or not?
No, so you're starting from scratch.
Okay, listen, of course I know Mrs. Richardson. We really got involved into all the reform in New Zealand. But let's start by the beginning. Maybe some of you are aware that, for example, Bloomberg named Peru the 4th emerging market country to invest in last week. We are currently, for the past 20 years, we have been growing by 60%. According to the World Bank, 60% of our population is now considered middle class. Extreme poverty has been reduced from historical levels of 30 and even 40% to less than 10%. Our GDP is around $300 billion measured by PPP. And for the past 20 years, we haven't had inflation going above 3%. And only 2 times did we see a decrease in GDP. That was in the Russian default in 1998. And only, if I recall correctly, we fell only by 0.1%. And then in the financial bubble of 2008, which basically we didn't grow, not that we really decreased. So you wonder how all of this came about, especially if we look back to the early 90s. In the early 90s of the previous government, 85-90, we had an accumulated inflation of 2,178,000%. I don't know if you have any idea of what that means. It's basically, it's just a number. You have to really live through the process to realize how can inflation, hyperinflation, destroy a country. But at the same time, all of this economic collapse, mainly due to mismanagement, not export prices falling down or things like that, was within a very difficult context of actually in which we had the Shining Path, which was the bloodiest, together with Pol Pot, terrorist groups acting in the world in recent history. During the period 1980 until the top brass of Shining Path were caught and peace ensued, it is estimated that over 70,000 people, Peruvians, died. And Shining Path was not a popular movement. At its peak, it had only 2,000 members, but all of we have seen what a small group of terrorists can do. So really living, at the time, I was in my early 30s, running a prosperous business, growing, but I had to go throughout Lima streets surrounded by 8 bodyguards. So you just get an idea how it was. The country was in a total collapse, and it was exactly like living in a war with bombs going all throughout the city and political assassinations, etc., and so on, which Elena had a chance to see. At that time, there was 2 things were happening. One, as business people, we started to see if this was a war, as was my personal case. I wanted to know in which position did I have to fight this war. On the other hand, the end of the government came to an end, and the democratically elected President Fujimori started his government in July 1990, surrounded by all this collapse. Fortunately, he took a political decision, which is crucial in my opinion. Mrs. Richardson has mentioned the New Zealand experience, absolutely crucial, to concentrate his personal and his government's efforts on political issues and safety things, leaving the economic reform of the country in the hands of the private sector. We were, at the time, we organized ourselves in several, we had, of course, our business confederation. I was vice president at the time, and we really, all of the economic reform was placed in our hands. So, for example, the first task was to beat inflation. We did that within a year. If there are many parallels to what New Zealand did. I mean, we did, the economic reform was done on one single day. The Prime Minister at the time, simply in one speech to the nation, all kinds of subsidies were wiped out. Not a single subsidy was remain in place. We as private businessmen, I was personally in charge of seeing how the population could absorb this, because we feared of social uprising. You have to realize from 1 minute to the next, the price of oil, gasoline, went up 60 times, 60. So that doesn't matter in my case, which I drove a BMW around Lima. But you can imagine what people have to, when they take up a bus to go 1 or 2 hours to their job place, what it means to price go up 60 times. Anyway, the next thing that was done, government started to live exactly within its own means. And the process started to get the government out of money-losing ventures. This of course, in time developed into a very well-thought privatization program. So, to go quickly, inflation was stopped within a year, and we haven't seen inflation, as I said before, about 3% ever since. In the meantime, the usual macroeconomic, fiscal, and so on measures were done. The economy was run by a professional group of economists, a lot of help with World Bank and IDB. But But there are interesting aspects of all of this. As I said several times now, the private sector was deeply involved. For example, the privatization process was designed by us. It was if we wanted to privatize a particular company or a particular industry, a committee was formed by private sector people. And we looked for CEOs or general managers, in other words, with very busy people from the private sector. We asked them to come on board and do privatization as quickly as possible. Since they were very busy in their own business, this was something that was not paid, they didn't get a salary. They did the job in the most the quickest way you can imagine to get out and get back to business. I think this was very innovative, and really corruption and things like that were, I cannot say eliminated completely, but certainly the system did not allow for corruption. So the same in the judiciary. The judiciary, as the rest of the country, was collapsed. So how can we could conduct business? So we grouped together lawyers, and they changed the laws for arbitration. So basically, all that has to do today with commercial discrepancies that have to be sorted out are not sorted out in the judiciary, are sorted out in different arbitration courts, all belonging to the private sector. You have the arbitration court of the Chamber of Commerce of Lima, or, for example, the arbitration court of the University of Lima, which is a private institution. So those are the kind of things the private sector did. Then we had another problem, how, especially in my country, with the vagaries of politics, we said, how can we be sure that these changes we are making perdure, regardless of who is governing the country? And we found an answer in signing free trade agreements. So the free trade agreements do not only have an economic purpose, as Mrs. Richardson said, which of course they do, but in our case, it had a very important political thing, because it locked in most of the most important reforms we have. Today, the Peruvian trade, 97% of our trade is under free trade agreements. We have signed with all the major economic areas or countries, and we are negotiating right now a free trade agreement with India, which is the last big market we have to negotiate with. This, for example, all of these treaties will not allow for any subsidies to get back in place, or will not allow to our labor laws to go against international agreements, and so forth. As a result, in 1990, the GDP of this country was $35 billion only. And all of our exports were below $10 billion. Today, we have $100 billion in exports. We are the top producer in asparagus. We are amongst the top in grapes and so forth. Our economy has changed from industrial or primary economy to a service economy. 60% of our economy is now service. And even though the world is in this recession problem, especially in Europe, we haven't felt that, because our growth is sustained today by our local market, which is growing at 20% a year. And in a context where we have a very professional central bank that is holding back, because you really couldn't expect such growth rates with high interest rates like we have. We have high interest rates for mortgages around 9%. And that's because the central bank is putting the brakes without really stopping the dynamics of the economy. So, and We recently, a year ago, we had a new president elected. We were quite concerned because he was following according to what he said in his speeches, along the lines of Venezuela Chavez. But it took, and he won by a short margin, but he's now the president. And he quickly realized that really his reforms and any ideas, any original ideas, so to speak, on the economic front, simply cannot be put in place in the context of the economy. So it simply would stop. Now, again, Mrs. Richardson explained very, very clearly what you need to do to, number one, I don't remember, it was the case in New Zealand that you had to stabilize. We had to stabilize the country first, and then to put in place the reforms. And as I said, besides the political decision, the decision of us as private sector was crucial. Before the reform, for what we call non-traditional exports had a subsidy of 30%, and the business people involved were willing to forego that and open up the country. So, Elena, that's what I can tell you very briefly.
I have to say, Manuel, that I'm personally happy, first of all, that you're here and you're talking about it, but secondly, because everybody knows me in Greece about, for two things. But the fact that I'm a Greek that lived abroad for about 18 to 20 years, and then about the fact that I worked with Peru. But a lot of criticism is coming on in Greece about Peru because they have the feeling that I destroyed your country. And I'm so happy to hear you because I'm hearing something completely opposite to what my extraordinary critics are saying. But thank you very much. I'm not sure if there are any questions right now, or should we also listen to Maria Georgalos from Argentina and then have all the questions together? Should we do that? Yeah. So Manuel, if you could be patient for a little bit, I'm absolutely positive you will have a barrage of questions. Let's also cover Argentina with Maria Georgalos, and let's go on. In the meantime, αν υπάρχει, αυτό δεν το... όχι, η Μαρία είναι και αυτή live.
There is also live. I don't know if there is somebody who'd like perhaps to ask a question waiting for Mary to appear. We have a person wanting to ask a question. Please use the microphone so that there can be simultaneous translation. Well, nobody expected questions to be asked now, I suppose that's the reason why. Mrs. Georgalos is ready.
Έτσι. Πρόσεχε.
Είμαστε από τη σκέψη στη δράση.
Χαίρετε. Είμαι ο Φάνης.
You see, we truly move from thought to action. My surname is Vassos from the American College of Salonika. I carefully heard the speaker from Peru talking about a transformation, a full change that was made in Peru, something that alludes to a change in values in society and priorities. And I also heard Mr. Gargatsoulis, who said that here in Greece we have not reached this point, and I carefully heard Mr. Reid, who measured the impact of different activities vis-à-vis results and change. I can't help wondering whether there is a study carried out, whether there is an approach or an elaboration regarding change of priorities in a society. When we have a mechanism like that of open interviews, for instance, then we need meritocracy in a society for these procedures to work. If there are different priorities in a society, if this society has a different group thinking rationale, then in an open discussion you can see situations like a football match. That is, you see people divided in two groups, politicians supporting one speaker, politicians of the opposition supporting somebody else. So are there mechanisms and are there studies that have examined this issue, how it is that people's priorities, not values, it's an exaggerated word, how people's priorities are affected or influenced by some activities?
Βάλουμε την ερώτηση. Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ, κύριε Βάρβαρο.
Thank you very much for your question. We need to wait for a second and then we'll answer. We have Maria Georgalos with us. Speak in English.
Δεν έχεις το live stream on, αλλά you can listen to me, right?
I cannot look at you.
Oh, you can even look at me. Impressive. I'm happy. Okay, Maria Georgalos, economist, δουλεύει, είναι director, είναι διευθύντρια σε τι είναι διευθύντρια?
Στο Washington National Advisor.
Director of the Washington National Advisors. She comes from Greece and the island of Chios. Her parents do, that is. She was born in Argentina, and let me tell you something which is very interesting. Mary heard about Thought for Action through the social media, and she immediately wrote a message to us, and she said, please, if you think that I have anything to add, I'd be more than willing to do so. And there she is. She did the right thing and the wrong thing at the same time by volunteering. So she volunteers to intervene. Well, Mary, you have the floor. Talk to us about Argentina. Well, I would really like to speak in Greek. However, my Greek is not very good. No, it's exceptional, says Mrs. Gavras. This is all that I can manage, says the speaker. That's the reason why I'll switch to English.
First of all, I would like to congratulate Elena for this great initiative. As you know, well, my name is Maria Georgalos. I have Greek roots. Both my parents are from Chios, and I was born and raised in Argentina. So what I would like to do is just to talk about the sentiment, what it was like to live and work in Argentina during the 2002 crisis. So I have to say that the 2001 crisis was one of the hardest crises that Argentina went through. It was not like a civil war, like the one that Greece had to face after World War II. Even so, it's really hard for me to find a word to define it. It was the financial and the political system collapse. But not only that, I think the value system collapsed as well. All I can tell you is that the feeling, all that happened from one day to the other, it took us by surprise. Of course, that the early signals were there. 3 years before, there were negative incentives, tax increases, salary cuts, plus unemployment was rising by 52%, a deep recession. GDP fell minus 3.4 in 1999, minus 0.8 in 2000, minus 4.4 in 2001, and minus 2.9 in 2002, and social unrest. And by social unrest, I mean violent strikes, and more than 20 people died in December 2001. So these signals were not easily acknowledged. The main political party is not even dare to question the effectiveness of the convertibility plan. In the 1999 elections, many of the parties were fighting to have the convertibility plan in their agenda. You know, some policymakers thought that that scenario would be sort of a short-term recession. And after all, the convertibility plan successfully passed the tequila test in 1994. So just to say some words about the pillars of the convertibility plan. It was a monetary rule by which the local currency was pegged to the US dollar on a one-to-one basis. Plus, the exchange rate was set by Congress law. This was in response to the hyperinflation crisis of the 1989. The shadow of another scenario of hyperinflation was so strong that triggered the fear of policymakers to question the effectiveness of the plan, to bring solutions to the table, and to think ahead of the crisis. Fear to get out of the plan from the main actors of society, especially banks, denial from some policymakers and bankers to address the right solution to the crisis, and a lack of actions from politicians were one of the main areas of the events of the crisis of 2002. The consequences is what we call the corralito, a bank run where deposits were frozen. So, getting back to the question, what it was like to live and work in Argentina during that period? Needless to say that people felt angry, felt humiliated, and worst of all, hopeless. People thought all their efforts were in vain and the future was lost and there was no way to see the light at the end of the tunnel. The events came so fast and at such a rapid pace, like a snowball effect, that people did not have time to react, to realize what was going on, what was happening, what's next. The best way to describe this was like living in a survival stage. In our minds, everything was a threat. A civil war scenario, perhaps, it was in our thoughts and in our conversations. I will just give one example. People were fired from their jobs, their severance payment was deposited in the bank, but they were not allowed to take the whole amount out. So, looking back to 2002, the question is, do we need to reach the edge in order to implement new reforms? In a global economy, what skills and what risks are politicians willing to take and policymakers in order to prevent a crisis or to manage a crisis when it is in the eye of the storm? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. From my end, should we now take να πάρουμε τώρα τις ερωτήσεις, πώς τα βλέπεις, Πενελό?
Ναι.
Shall we accept questions at this time? Mr. Reid needs to answer the question for each team, and then we'll accept some of the questions, and then we'll have a wrap-up. Mr. Reid, you have the floor.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, this is an interesting question, and I'm not aware. There probably exist, but I'm not aware of studies that have done used data based on surveys and stuff to see how values have changed over time with respect to certain public sector reforms like civil service reform aimed at depoliticization. But I have two examples that I think will speak to the question. First place, I mean, as we all know, values change slowly, typically, right? It's a rare event for values held by a large set of people to change rapidly. They tend to change slowly. And the first example I wanted to cite was when the United States moved towards depoliticization within its federal civil service. It's a process that took scores of years. It did not happen all at once. They passed the Pendleton Act in, I forget the year, it was like 1873 or something like that. I forget the exact year. But the Pendleton Act covered a small subset of federal government employment and essentially put in all your sort of typical screens and due process protections to make it depoliticized. And the existing parties that were not in power, of course, did not trust the Pendleton Act. They thought it basically cemented in place political cronies of the party that was in power, right? And so this was actually turned out to be part of the beauty of that act, only encompassing a subset of federal employment, because what happened over time was, as new administrations came in, they would expand the coverage of that act to encompass another 5,000 or 10,000 people. They would put their people in. Before the expansion occurred, then the expansion would lock their people in. But the recruitment and selection for all the covered positions henceforward was subject to all those due process protections. And over time, the people began to view the positions that were recruited through the meritocratic procedures to be actually working okay. And so it began to be more accepted. And then, after a while, there were no more significant expansions of the coverage of that act. So the point here was that getting an act in place made it possible to demonstrate that the recruitment and selection procedures, maybe not for the first set of people who were in, but beyond that, it worked reasonably well. And gradually, it got more and more widely accepted. Now let me give another example that illustrates that this can go wrong, right? I mean, I worked in Albania for a number of years, and we tried to do the same sort of thing. We put in place a civil service law that had the state-of-the-art due process protections to depoliticize the civil service. The civil service was restricted to about 2% of public employment, and it looked like it was working really well for about five years, until the opposition took power, and they didn't trust it, right? And they basically subverted the entire law. Instead of sort of accepting the people who are in and then expanding the coverage and, et cetera, following the path that the U.S. did, they basically subverted the whole law. So obviously the attitudes had not changed sufficiently in Albania over that 5 or 6 year period to allow the same sort of dynamic that happened to have worked in the United States. Thank you.
Λοιπόν, υπάρχουν άλλες ερωτήσεις εδώ, αρκετές.
Are there any more questions? Yes, there are. Quite a few, I can see. Good afternoon. My name is Stefanidis. I'm a simple civilian. This is what I'll call myself. So I would like to ask the two ladies, first and foremost, something regarding the relation of banks of Greece to the crisis. What was the role the banks played in relation to the government, the administrations? And regarding Mrs. Richardson, I would be very much interested in hearing about the role banks played during their crisis, especially for SMEs and small enterprises. What was the role of the banks? I shall answer very fast. Greece has a banking system which is quite, I would say, which is not very developed. And this is a system that is very free here. There is a problem with the microphone. Sorry, it's not me, says the speaker. Dodge responsibility. It's not me. Somebody did not activate my microphone. Thanos is a volunteer, so I can't even tell him off or tell him that you're dismissed. You'll be dismissed tomorrow. He'll dismiss me tomorrow, I think. Well, the banking system in Greece, let me repeat, is a little bit primitive. It's not very developed, if you wish. And this is one of the reasons why the Greek banking system was not exposed to toxic bonds to the same extent as the Spanish banking system. However, there is a particularity that might sound neoliberal on my part, precisely because the Greek economy is by 94%, especially private economy, the private sector has 94% relation with the small mid-sized enterprises. Whether we have the right wing in power and in government, or the socialist movement, or any other party for that matter, the government enters this banking system and wedges its way into the banking system, so that the banking system can go on giving loans. And up until recently, the state guaranteed these loans. So we had guaranteeing projects for these loans, and at this time, when we have the conjecture of a very heightened crisis, this has gone, and we get the impression that banks became impersonal, mean, bad. They don't give people money. Yes, but if they hadn't had the guarantees in the past, they wouldn't have been able to give people money to begin with. But nobody knows. Comment off the microphone. Apologies, we didn't hear it. Now, answer. If you have a bank that has deposits, banks mainly have our deposits. The loss of banks is not something desirable in an economy. If a bank collapses, even though it may sound comforting at first, because we'll say that these mean bankers lost their jobs too, like us, but this is unfortunate because we lose our savings too, and this is something that we don't want. No government wants this. Without recapitalization, nothing happens. As we said at the beginning, when you recapitalize or when you give funds to a bank, you shouldn't only examine this. As Ruth said very correctly, you can't act in a fragmented manner. You can't have piecemeal reforms or save 1 out of 10 and take it for granted that the remaining 9 will save themselves because the 1 you chose to rescue saved themselves. You see that in other countries, banks receive a lot of loans. They keep the loans to themselves and they don't give any money to people out there. This happens because we have not given the correct answer to the question of how we should cope with the crisis. We haven't done this because we believe that the crisis is the crisis of Cologne, of Bern, of a small city in Switzerland or Germany. Not that it is a crisis of informal economy here in Greece. I'll give the floor to Ruth regarding the role of the banks in the crisis in New Zealand.
New Zealand did not have a banking crisis. We had a public debt crisis. So the degree of public debt that built up got to the point where our international lenders were no longer prepared to lend to us, or if they were, on terms that were just crippling for the country. So that's the first issue. So we had to deal with what was driving, in this case, the bank's adverse behaviour, which was our very poor policy. So we had to make a policy correction. We wanted to be a well-banked country. We still rely as a country on foreigners' savings to fund our investment. But we've got to be very well behaved to get bank money on terms that make sense for a business. First issue. Second issue is the only actual bank crisis we had was the night that I became the Minister of Finance, the night we won the election. So we won the election at 10 o'clock at night, and at 11 o'clock I got a phone call that champagne was still in my veins, and I got a phone call to say that the state-owned bank, which had been partially privatised, so it was something like 65% state-owned, 35% private sector, that it was broke. That its activities in Australia, really more than New Zealand, meant that there was, of the order of about $600 million, which at that time was huge in the early 90s. And so we had a particular problem with the state-owned bank, and my 2 remedies were to separate it out to a good bank, bad bank, to rehabilitate the good bank and to privatise it properly, 100%. And one of Australia's major banks bought that bank, and then over time to realise the assets of the bad bank. So in the end, we ended up not being out of pocket, but it was traumatic at the time. New Zealand in the recent global financial crisis had no problems with the banks at all. They are well capitalised, and to be fair, primarily the New Zealand banking system is a subsidiary of the Australian banking system. So both New Zealand and Australia had very prudential supervision of the banks and very good behaviour on their part, which is why both economies survived the global financial crisis in a much better position than, say, countries in this part of the world. We really did have bad banks.
I'm really sorry, but duty calls, I do have to leave. I would really like to thank the speakers. I really learned some things that I will find useful, and I'll find it useful in asking my questions to the various panels I manage. And I understand that it is us together with the political system that have to move on to be able to do something in this country and find how to exit this crisis, because politicians alone cannot do it. But we should not react all the time. That, you know, we should accept change as well. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm now going to replace Penelope. Okay. We have Maria with us from Argentina, and we have Manuel with us. Do we have any questions for Maria? Okay, we'll have questions for Maria now, and then questions for Manuel, and then questions for Ruth and Gary again. Do we have any questions? Is it because I'm standing up? Okay, feel free to ask any questions, but we need a microphone. Okay, so a question for Argentina. We've heard a lot. Excuse me. Maria, can you understand Greek well enough? Yes. If I can't understand, I'll tell you to speak in English. But I'll let you know. So much has been said. It's been said often in Greece that Argentina had a lot of problems, but it managed to cope. And usually this is a criticism from the left-wing parties to any effort to reform that if we remain within the euro area. So they say that, you know, Argentina's fared just well. So that's the example we should follow. Given that you are in Argentina, and perhaps you know a few things about Greece, would you have any comment to make about this? I think that Argentina and Greece do have a lot of similar things. They've got a similar culture.
Very similar. Argentina is a very new country. We have a young democracy. It's a 30-year-old democracy. And the natural resources that Argentina has is completely, are different than those of Greece. I'm not saying they're better, it's good or bad. But structurally, the country is different. So what happened in Argentina, I don't know frankly, I don't know what the solution or what the recipe would be for Greece. But what I can tell you, after the crisis of 2002, which was pretty traumatic, what Argentina decided to do was to create competitiveness, innovation in the country. So, and also there was a strong will from the Argentine people to build strong institutions, to build a strong democracy, to allow a friendly environment for, investments. Now, a company can take, a loan for 9.9% in pesos. Of course, a lot of things that need to be done, But on the other hand, Argentina has been out of the financial markets for so many years. And the question is, can Greece afford to be out of the financial markets so long? So, you know, I don't know if it's answering your question, and but the concept of drawing.
Maria, I think you answered as much as you could, and I think you did a very good job in presenting it. Έχουμε κάποια άλλη ερώτηση για τη Μαρία? I'll translate at the same time. Όχι. Έχουμε ερώτηση για τον Manuel Sotomayor.
Do we have any questions for Maria, for Manuel Sotomayor? Do we have Manuel online? Do we have him on Skype? Maria, thank you very much. You can say your question twice, once in Greek, once in English. Okay, as I said, I'm Fanis Vavalis from the Anatolia Business Institute of the American College of Thessaloniki. I listened to Mr. Sotomayor carefully. He talked about a transformation in Peru, and this was a radical transformation. It did not only concern economic factors, but also the way in which citizens saw their everyday life in the city or everything. And as I said previously, with the excellent example Mr. Reid gave about public administration in Uganda, I can understand that a similar procedure in a different country could lead support groups for a specific person due to whatever relationship. What I want to ask is this great change in priorities, because essentially we have our own system of values, we all do, but it depends on the circumstances to which side we show to others. So how did this radical change come about in Peru? How did you change your priorities as citizens?
Happening at Peru with great pleasure, actually, the transformation that took place. And it looked to me that it wasn't only a transformation in economy or in the political system, but it was a total transformation of the country, that all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, through a process, its citizens started prioritizing different things. So all of a sudden, productivity became a priority, fairness became a priority, responsibility, teamwork. I don't know what these priorities were, but definitely priorities changed in a major way that made sweeping changes. My question is, what were the catalysts, what were the conditions that led to this transformation of priorities within each individual in this country? Thank you.
Listen, let me answer you with my personal experience. As I told you, I was in my early 30s, and I was running a good business, and I was surrounded by this complete collapse of the country. So I started to, this Elena knows very well, I started to meet with other people in my generation, early 30s, and we asked ourselves, what are we going to do? Are we going to stay in our country? Do we want to live here? What do we have to do? We, apart from what I told you before, we created Peru 2021, which it is still an organization even today. And as private people, we met in a hotel for a couple of days to see what our vision was of this country for the future. That's why we call it 2021, because that's our bicentennial. But anyway, definitely you describe it very well. It was a complete transformation because we thought either we do something or we lose this country. There where we had good leadership from the in the private sector because, as I said, even in industries that were heavily subsidized, its leaders were able to forego all those benefits because they believed there was a major benefit for all of us in opening up the market. So really, I think it's the context of I don't want to say that you need a complete crisis to change, but definitely this context did make us look inwards and say, listen, we got to get out, we got to change, we got to get this country back on its feet, and we did.
I think the answers are pretty telling. Νομίζω ότι η απάντηση... Oh, Manuel, I'm going to be speaking in 2 languages at once, okay?
Okay.
All right, so θα μιλάω στις 2 γλώσσες μαζί γιατί δεν μπορεί να πάει μετάφραση στον Manuel. Νομίζω ότι η απάντηση...
So I'll speak in 2 languages at the same time because Manuel cannot have the translation for a certain reason. As I said before, I have received criticism for my work in Peru, and I haven't visited this country for about 5 to 7 years, in fact, and I would be very much interested in going back because I can see that a country that develops by 60% is highly interesting indeed. Do we have any more questions? Speaker repeating in English.
Been in the country for a while, and listening to you just really increased my appetite to want to come back and visit you. I know you've been waiting for me for a while to come and visit, but having a 60% growth, it's really a very telling story of the changes of the country.
Would like to take this opportunity to emphasize, I have been doing so throughout what I was telling you, that there is a role for the private sector. We made, you know very well what we did in Peru 21. It was just a group of 50 business people. And I really said, I really believe that we had a very important impact in changing the long term. The short term was handled by the leaders at the time. You know them, all of them. The Jorge Camet, myself, Picasso, all of those. We handled the short term. But through the organized business people that believed in a modern country, we have been able to influence throughout our business community. So there's a lot to do amongst the business people.
Can I ask a question? I have one question to ask you, Manuel. Θέλω να ρωτήσω μια ερώτηση τον Μανουέλ, γιατί νομίζω ότι γυρνάμε γύρω από την ουρά μας όλη μέρα σήμερα. Όλοι θέλουμε να κάνουμε μεταρρυθμίσεις και κάποια στιγμή η Πενελόπη Γαβρά είπε...
Mrs. Gavra said, when she heard Ruth, she said, oh, I hope this happens in Greece, but it never will. So what's the point discussing it? It sounds interesting. Ruth came from New Zealand and Helen has lived in the States, so she might think that things can change, but you know, nothing's going to change here. My question to Manuel is, how many years did it take for Peru to, say, awaken these 50 entrepreneurs to come to this group and create a catalyst for reform within the industrial private sector community? How dire does a situation have to be for not to have to prevent this mechanism from continuing to exist. The speaker is repeating the same question in English.
Today, Ruth Richardson came here really excited to tell us that destruction is really the best way to go about it, because after you have a destruction, you actually have a resurrection. And I am also, I want to be a change maker, an agent of change. However, all of us Greeks tend to also be extremely cynical, and we believe that the systems are there to not allow us to continue to do any change. So my question is really, how long did it take Peru to be in a state of disarray? How many defaults had you had to have? How many cholera attacks? How many thousands of people had to die from Sendero Luminoso? How many Code de Queda we had to have, curfews? How many times people had to be abducted? How long this whole civil unrest had to last before you managed to get your group of 50 business people together to sit in a room for 2 days and decide what's the vision of the country before you decide to leave the country? Because you, Manuel, as everybody and every other Peruvian, could leave the country and live elsewhere, right? So how?
Yes.
Yeah. So you choose not to leave. You chose to stay in the country. How long did it take you?
Listen, I think books can be written about to answer your question, but you remember, you cannot say it really is only because of the shining path. You remember in the late 60s and throughout until 1980, we had a military government, which really the only thing they did was build a big government, big state, no real ideology. But there was no room for us. We were at the university at that time, and we only seek to go abroad to get a good job. Then in the early 80s, we already started a round of liberalization of the country. You know the actors very well. You remember very well Roberto Abusada and all his team. Unfortunately, the president at the time was not convinced and killed all this liberalization and making the country competitive and so on. And then we had this illuminated president, Alan Garcia, from 85 to 1990, that also highly ideologized and had no idea how to manage the economy. And parallel to this, shining path was growing up, and this was dismissed as something that was going on in the highlands with no impact to us.
What's happening in our country.
Only when the Shining Path decided to attack Lima was when the people started to really react. But I cannot say that it has to take. Remember all the confluences of bad things that were coming, getting together.
Well, that was part of them.
So it's very difficult to tell you in 3 years, 5 years. It's not like that. No?
How long did it take Peru?
Listen, since President Fujimori and everybody got the idea together that we had to get this country up and running, I would say between 3 to 4 years. 1 year to stop inflation dead on its tracks. Mrs. Richardson knows very well how to do that. There are many tools to do it. And to get the finances back in shape, 2 or 3 years, to get back into the international financial community. And then we really started growing in 1995. We had something like a 13% growth in GDP.
13% higher than China. Το
Yes.
Περού το 1994 ανέβαινε με 13%.
Peru in 1994 had a higher growth rate even than China.
To get it any more questions? Θέλετε κάποιος να κάνει ερωτήσεις? Όχι. Τελειώσαμε.
So, oh, okay, sorry, there is someone behind you, the lady. And the gentleman. Good afternoon. I haven't heard the whole discussion, but I would like to ask, all this change, does it come through industry, the capital, the government? And how important was the role of education as the basis of this? How has education formed the ability to collaborate for growth in Peru, and how could this contribute in Greece? Shall we also ask the other question? Because it's a general question, okay. Good afternoon. My name is Stavros Zadakis. I'm an economics major at the American College of Greece.
If you take the average Greek off the street and you ask him what's a government bond, he's not going to answer. You ask him what the mnemonio is, he's not going to answer. You ask him what the Troika is doing, he's not going to answer. So my question is as such, we heard your stories about all these reforms and how it worked and how it didn't work, but how do you expect to see the results and the fruit of these reforms in a country where information is not only hard to get by, but even if you do make the attempt to find the information, you get treated with the questions as like, you know, what's your problem? Τι σε νοιάζει εσένα?
Κινησμός, Λοιπόν,
Fully.
Ναι, okay. Γίνεσαι μέλος του Thought for Action.
So yes, you become a member of Thought for Action to answer questions just like yours.
Which was given to you in Greek, which I will translate, is basically saying, how is education of the regular individuals helping in the actual have my personal tutor here. How is education? Manuel, no lo vas a saber, pero aquí está mi padre que me está hablando también.
Say hello to him.
Okay, he's saying hello to you back. Okay, so the question basically is, what is really the importance that you would place in the reform and the actual application of reforms, as long as in relation to the population's education? So maybe you want to answer both questions together if the second one applies to you.
Μπορείτε να απαντήσετε και στα δύο ερωτήματα.
No, on the second question I can make a comment, but education is a very big issue. We have been involved. This is one area of the country that we haven't been able to reform. It is still handled by the left ideology, but by left I mean of the 1950s or 1960s union, and the previous government was able to start a reform which was stopped by this one. However, what is going on? What is going on, since the public education is so poor, it is being slowly replaced by private education, by just the market. I'm not saying that this is good or bad. I'm just telling you what is going on. As the income of the people are started to increase, and since you can have, that was part of our reform in the 90s, you can have an education school or university running for profit and not necessarily non-profit. There's the private sector at all levels of the economy, except the really poor, which are being the one really hurt, are able to choose now a school here. The highest, you will have to pay a tuition of $1,000 per month. That's the most expensive. But you can have a private education for $100 or even less. So that is something that is that makes me a little bit optimistic, because really the education, we haven't been able to accomplish much. Unfortunately, the poorest people that do not have this option are really the ones that are suffering. And I would say we have tried everything from our private position, but this is something that there is lack of political decision. As to the other question, which really I don't know much about, when we started Peru 2021 and all our efforts in trying to change the country, we thought that the task was unsurmountable. It looked impossible to change this country. So we decided, and we talked around with people, with other business people, and they said, no, I have sent my family to Spain. No, I'm going to live for Miami, and so on. So we started, as I told you before, we started to concentrate only on the believers. We said, let's forget the unbelievers. So we worked only with the believers, and and we ourselves had faith that if we gather enough people, that means critical mass, we could really make an impact, and we have.
In that note, Manuel, I have to say that it's a very positive note, and it gives me the lead to the final part of this day's seminar, which is basically the one that we will sum up and give pointers of how the reform should take place. Λοιπόν, είσαστε έτοιμοι να κάνουμε ένα...
So, are you ready for a summary? No, this is not going to be something to close with. This is going to be the beginning. After this, we'll begin, in fact.
Πολύ ενδιαφέρουσες συζητήσεις που ακούσαμε σήμερα. Εκτός του γεγονότος ότι η Ελλάδα είναι λίγο... Ακούω το...
Sorry. So, what do we learn from... What's the bottom line of this discussion today? In my opinion, and I'm going to hear from the other panelists to see what they think. I believe that we have inertia. We know our problems very well. We can write them down. We can write them in a book. We can sit and moan about them forever. We can do this. Panagiotis and I have done this, but kind of more pleasantly to avoid suicide, basically. But okay, this way or the other way, or however you put it, we do have problems. We have a bloated public sector. We have a social insurance fund with like useless employees. Okay, that's the end of it. You want to do something, you want to transfer a property, it takes forever. We can sit and write full volumes about this. We have inertias, we have systems of vested interests. We have a very bad private sector. We have monopolies or oligopolies, cartels, and they await and they see, why do you want us to change things in the private sector? It's fine, meaning that they're doing fine. So we've got all these problems. And in parallel, there's a discussion that's kind of become slightly monotonous. It's a drone. We need changes, we need changes, we need changes. Vote for us, we'll do changes, we'll make changes. They won't do good changes, we'll do good changes, we'll do good reforms and all this. And in the end, we've reached a point of ultimate cynicism that there'll be no reforms. We'll still have the same system. And I'm very happy that we have the two panelists here and the other two via Skype and Mr. Pisaredes. So what we've learnt today, or what I've learnt, is that to do this, We need the will. And it should be something of a religion. We should have the faithful, those who believe that reforms should go ahead, those who have seen the light and those who have not. So, though the unbelievers should just move out of the way, and the believers, you know, it's a boring lesson. I have to be funny. So, the believers, and I like the idea of Mr. Manuel Sotomayor, and I remember it because he was building on that when I was working there. He got 50 people under the age of 50, and that's where they were called the Group of 50. They were all working in the private sector and academics, and by academics, he meant, you know, not Greek academics, and sorry, professor, you know what I'm talking about, not public sector academics who just have a little job there. We're talking about people who've written a lot of papers, and all of these got together to see if they want to stay in Peru or to leave, to live the rest of their life, as many others had done. And perhaps this is what we could do, if you want, through thought for action or through your own offices, find 50, 40 people, whatever, and we should slowly try to build this critical mass that believes that the role of Greece is not to be in the yellow pages of the Sun or on the headlines of the Financial Times or in the various comic strips that, you know, the Greeks, their ouzo-loving, Zorba dancing good for nothings. So if you really believe, come here, come with us, or make your own group and I'll come with you. But what else we should do? I believe that we should listen to to what's happening, what I call the listening model, a bottom-up listening model. There is no answer to the crisis from out with, or from a minister's office, or from a troika, or from us four sitting here. If it has not first been heard and tried at the base. And this is a formality in essence. In Peru, we did exactly that. We went and asked, you know, how do you do this? I don't voice my opinion. You know, I would just write it on a paper and I give it. So we took this piece of paper and we bypassed the whole spaghetti system, we deleted it, and we just used this little paper. There's just this one paper. I want to sell you this for this amount, X amount. That's it, X amount, okay. Put it in the land registry, X amount, okay. Elena, do you want this? Yes, okay, no, all right. So we should listen, and we should build on formality, and we should find our country's vision by finding those who believe that the country will progress. We won't say if only. We believe that it will happen. At the end of the day, if there are two conclusions from today's event, I'll be happy. If we can kind of slightly limit this cynicism, the prevailing cynicism, if we make it smaller, even by the breadth of a hair, and also if we manage to communicate that there are still Greeks who are passionate about their country and want to see it succeed.
Really is to you, the young generation. I can't believe you are telling me that your young colleagues are not scandalized by what's transpiring. The unemployment rate typically in unreformed Europe for people under the age of 25 is 50%. That is just a social time bomb, and it's your generation that's got to mobilize against it. And in particular, you now have the benefit that Manuel and myself and other reformers did not have. You've got the social media at your disposal. There's no excuse now for saying it's hard to get information. Information is just a Google search away. You can look at what works. You can look at the tendencies of countries and the policy settings they have adopted that enjoy high rates of employment, high rates of growth. You only have to look at any Google to understand that the competition is not sleeping, that there is more and more competition. You can learn today of periods of transformation, but it's in your hands as to whether you want to make it happen. So I've got a lot of optimism that what lies at the heart of successful reform, which is more vibrant, competitive individuals and private sector, and a more modest, well-performed state. So to rectify the imbalance where the big state has crowded out private sector performance, the thing that gives me a lot of optimism is that this is the age where the individual is very much in charge, where misbehaviour by governments is quickly exposed, where the benefits of being able to trade ideas and goods and services is now very obvious. You know, it doesn't matter what corner of the world you're in, you're not untouched by globalization. You can access the world. And if you want a country in which you can capitalize on those advantages, then in my view, you've got to be a reformer. So, you know, it's up to you. You know, you can choose to sit on your hands and have your punishment dealt out to you, in a sense, by your lenders, because that's what's happening now in Greece. Or you can take control of your destiny. And I hope that the experience that you've had from disparate countries but with common elements, so Peru and New Zealand, for example, are in free trade agreements, that you can have the encouragement to know that you can press the reset button, that you can have a major course correction. And that's what I'm leaving you with. I am not for just tinkering. I'm not for small shifts. What's required is much more than the IMF or Europe could ever suggest. Mm-hmm. What's required is a course correction Greek style so that you can be the kind of powerhouse where you want not just to play here and visit your parents here, but to live and work here and create new opportunities for the next generation of young Greeks. So it's up to you, my friend. There has never been a better time for a young person in a country like this to make a major difference.
I completely agree.
And just as a brief follow-on to that, I mean, I think next steps, I would think, would be in order to feel empowered, you need to start talking amongst yourselves about what actions look like good ideas. I mean, you clearly have got a reasonable consensus on what's wrong, as far as I can see. But my fear is that if you spend all your time talking about what's wrong, it'll be continuous wringing of hands and pessimism. I think what you need is, as a group, and whether you call yourselves true believers or whatever, I mean, the issue is you'll rally around the underlying objective of moving to a more vibrant state where greater growth, more opportunities, more competitiveness, more openness, whatever. And the challenge is to come up with a bunch of ideas about how you could accomplish that. I mean, I think the Thought for Action is a possible vehicle for trying to accomplish that. I mean, I don't have any, commitments to one vehicle or another, but that's one possible vehicle for doing that. I mean, if somebody can come up with some other vehicle, fine. But
εγώ τι να πω. Το έξω από το χώρο το ξέρετε. Ωραία. Το μέσα.
All right, you know what it's like to look at things from outside. Do you know what it's like to look at things from within? Huh? If you want to be a reformer, you need to be prepared for pain. And I'm talking about a lot of pain. They're going to put you on a cross. They're going to crucify you. They're going to ridicule you. And perhaps it's now the time to talk about our individual experiences. I mean, I've suffered this greatly for over 20 years. Ridicule, crucifixion. But there's one thing in this system that can manage everything, can handle everything, and this is fear. People are afraid. It's not possible. Over 20 years. You know what I've seen? Do you know how many PhD students, graduates, do other countries have in their governments? How many? By comparison, Greece has more than most other countries. So what's at fault here? You need to understand that this silly model that kind of doesn't work for us now. Stop talking about this huge, all-consuming crisis. I'm talking about the actual state. Why is this not working? Because every time there's an effort, and I can talk about one and end here, you will see that all of us want to go and stretch our legs up to the fireplace and pull them back when we start feeling the heat. So it's not that people are unwilling. They kind of are on a theoretical basis, but this is different to what you've heard from Ruth and from Peru, or from our own history, perhaps. Here, things need to be changed radically, and you can't make an omelette without breaking any eggs. There's a huge controversy here. It's not a matter of a dozen conferences or whatever. From the election until now, do you know to how many working groups have gone? Quite a few, and everyone says the same things need to be changed. But next, what happened to the next one? We might have 500 people in the first meeting, 50 in the second one, and 1 in the last one, because he's called to do the work. Because of 2 reasons. Because people are completely confused. They're like, where are we going? Are we talking about something that's going to end tomorrow? Okay, we'll face it. We'll manage to survive this and we'll be fine. And this is what a lot of people feel. Others say, all right, that's me, I'm done. So lots of people just leave the country. The number of people who have left the public sector, for example, is twice than expected. Twice than expected. It's insane. There is no productive person, engineers, doctors, professors. They're all looking to escape. And now, the few who are left behind, with their morale all devastated, they're ridiculed, and because democracy has become much more aggressive. Terrorism has become much more aggressive. And I'm not talking about internal terrorism alone, but think about all this. So just one example. With the first MOU, and the macroeconomic instructions included a phrase that said, we need to have a functional review of Central Greek public administration. So what do you understand by this? Okay, give me 3 minutes to tell this story. My job is to monitor these things. So we see this, and there's a team working on this, and we say, what does this mean? Does it mean what I understand, to see what our key problems are, to solve them and move further down? Now, listen to the stakeholders involved. The minister. My dear minister, in 2 months, these guys are going to come back. This is before the MOU. And we're going to have to do something, because in the MOU, it stated that it has to happen in the next 3 months. And the minister just said, so? What does that have to do with me? Who does it have to do with? It concerns Papakostadounou. The government then believed most of them would actually confess to this if they wanted. If they wanted to take responsibility, they would say that all the balls were heading in one direction. The MOU just concerned Papandreou and Papakostadounou. Then, the second thing is going to go away. It's going to go away for 3-6 months. You know, we're just going to go ahead with our business, and they're going to go away. But then suddenly they saw that they're not going anywhere. It's actually getting worse. So let's see the functional review again. What do we need to do here? We need to do something. Who's going to do it? The MOU in the MOU, the Greek government had accepted for an international organization to do this, and an international organization came and it said, so where are the data? We don't trust the Greeks to do this. Okay, who's going to do it? On our side, we said, we're going to do it. Nobody else can do it, can they? Okay, 200 Greeks whose supposed pay for 6 months of work to midnight every day was 300 euros per month, and Mr. Sahinides took that down to 100 euros, and nobody has actually used these data. They did this because they understood that they felt that they were doing something to save their country. Now, how easy is it to spread this attitude? It's very easy. All the Greeks have left. Okay, there are 200 Greeks. There's people in Australia or whatever, and they're all working on the database, feeding into the database. Okay, so that was done. What happened next? The report was written. Okay, the international organization wrote the report. And then there's time for action. And who undertakes the action? Who? The minister. Yes. What does the minister do then? He's like, oh, come on. What are they? Yeah, we know about this. Okay. So that's it for 3 or 4 months. The international organizations and the bad troika were saying, what happened with this? What is it? It's nothing, you know, it's just general stuff. Instead of that, come on, let's promote another packet of measures, a milder, you know, as if I'm like really, really ill, and you're like, take an aspirin and that's it. That's what they're doing. So these 200 people who worked there, after a year, if you try and find them, because others came and looked them up, they couldn't find even 10 of these. What does this mean? Of course, the Greeks can join a cause, but then they can leave a cause as well, because they feel that they've been making fools of. What I mean is, because we're discussing who's going to head this movement, what I believe, what can you do from your post? How much can you contribute? How much of your free time can you spend? Just let's not discuss the problems. We all know how much we can do. the only thing that's easy now is to find data. When things get hard, I mean, when we're heading into a battle, how much are you prepared to take? So, after that, can you handle it? And fourth, all this environment, all this these stakeholders who are interested in just having cosmetic changes, not radical changes, and you see that suddenly the system is kind of getting a little bit better, and it will get a little bit better yet. So when, at the end of all this, where will you stand? Okay, so I want to avoid one thing, and perhaps we can't translate this for our foreign friends, but for me, I can explain it to the Greeks. I don't want to live a second change of regime. I don't want my generation to experience this. For my generation, I'm over 50. For my generation, I don't want to live through that again. I don't want to live a second pseudo-revolution. I don't want to live through this pseudo-lifestyle. I don't know what you think of this. I don't know that I'm angry. I've had enough. But I could do stuff. But I'm also kind of willing to leave. Am I a Greek? Yes, I am. So take all this together and see what you can do with it. So I've been informed that we have a lot of online questions, and they've actually been filmed. As you understand, after 7 hours, we won't be able to answer to all these questions, but because, as I said previously, this is not the end, it's the beginning. We will have these questions on the internet and we will answer them, and what I aim to do through Thought for Action is to start action, because I would like to live in Greece, Panayotis. It's a beautiful country. I'm not from Bangladesh. I'm from the beautiful country of Greece. And I feel that it still has a lot to offer to the world, as it has done over many years. And the short video I've made shows that the Greek spirit, even in the crisis, even at this difficult juncture, produces and innovates. And I believe that we can innovate. But I also believe that it won't be easy. And yes, we're heading into a war, but the more of us there are, the less they're going to attack each one of us. But there is one question that I've promised the gentleman here he can ask.
Yeah.
Hello, it is a great honor for me to have been here and to have heard all these important things that you said. And I think that I learned more things with respect to the Hellenic crisis and the global crisis. Let's say that, for the sake of argument, we become the image of Peru, and overnight we change everything that's wrong with Greece. Do you believe that the 10 million of us, the 11 million of us, can actually absorb all these things? Do we have the education in Greece? Yes, we do, says Mrs. Panaritis. In Peru, we have illiterate people. We had a country in which people speak in Quechua and Aymara, Indian idioms, that is their language, the official language is Spanish, and we spoke to them in English. It was a Babel town. What can I say? And this is one place. Peru is one example. Chile is another one. These are countries that achieved positive results. And what Ruth said is the best thing. And I apologize for interrupting your question. Great problems require big, innovative solutions. If you are ill, seriously ill, a little aspirin for children will do nothing to you. We either have the strength and the guts to pursue these solutions, or we'll stand with the backs against the wall waiting for the tsunami to go away. Yes, but you know the tsunami will also make the wall we're standing against collapse. So what's the point? Let me tell you that Greece has students, university students that burn, they burn Syntagma Square, the Constitution Square. There are people who finish their secondary education and they don't know what recycling is all about. 7 years ago, I visited Australia and each house had 2 recycling bins, one for foodstuff in order to be processed for composting, and the other garbage bank had to do with household garbage. So, we'll have to expect this generation that will have a better education than the previous one to do things. So what is the solution that you are proposing? I believe that even if reform occurs, then we don't have future believers. No, sorry. Then you haven't understood what reform is all about. As I said before, reform is not imposed downwards. If reform is pursued and this reform is not understood, or it doesn't go from the bottom to the top, then this is not reform to begin with. This is law enforced, and this is what we're trying to change. One law after the next, one regulation after the next that nobody's willing to take in because there is no legitimacy. This is what I want to say, that if education doesn't change, things will not change, no matter how many laws we change. Look, I'm trying to explain to you that if you're expecting us to change on the evolutionary scale and from the Homo sapiens to become another species in order to magically have the reform performed overnight, then this is something that will take very long to happen. I want to live in my country here and now, not 100 years. I want my country to lead now. Europe, Greece, and the world over. I don't want my country to lead the way 100 years from now.
Do you have a smartphone?
Yeah.
Yeah? Do you have an iPad?
No, it's a Sony Ericsson, actually.
All right, yeah. But it's transformed the way you do business, right? So you can sit here in this forum, you can talk to your friends. You would never go back to having the old telephone system. You would never go to what didn't work. So you've embraced the modernization of technology. Why don't you embrace the modernization of the economy of your country? And you know, for people of your age who live in my country now, they've only ever known an open economy. They've only ever known competitiveness. They could never understand an environment where currency was controlled, what they could buy was controlled, what they could import was controlled. They would never go back to the system. The best way to lock in the reforms are to move to the more modern way in which you do so much business as an individual, to make the public policy reflect the same kind of modernization. And when people experience the benefit, better goods and services, more responsive state sector, more opportunities, people of your age group being able to set up businesses, to employ or be employed, you will wonder why it was for so long you stuck to a failed model.
Thank you.
Oh gosh.
Okay.
I told you we're starting now. Okay, let's take one more question.
And then
just one more question because we're slightly dead. Ella, Nico.
Καλησπέρα, λέγομαι Νίκος Ρόμπος.
My name is Nikos Rompopoulos. Good afternoon. I'd like to ask a relatively simple question, but I think that the answer is rather difficult. What I believe is that Greeks, throughout the past few decades, have learned to expect everything from the state. Perhaps they've always expected everything from the state. Having heard all presenters today, I've realized that the solution to the problem is less state. Less of a state solution. What we expect is for changes to come from the bottom to the top. How can we manage to convince the people that their past mentality is wrong? How can we mobilize them to the right direction? Ruth set the record straight, and she said certain things in a clear way. And this is what experience shows and dictates. But Greeks, on the contrary, believe that the solution will come from the state and will come from the top. How can we achieve this? If we achieve this, it's going to be very nice. If we start to change, and if we can afford to wait for 1 or 2 years, we'll see positive results. But how do we start? First of all, I would tell you to buy my book, or I'll give it to you for free to see how it is that this is done. Second, structural reform happens upstream. Macroeconomic reform, that is, if you want to cut subsidies, this is a top-down procedure. You need to combine the two. You don't convince people when you perform a downward reform. You just do it and get it over with. You don't need to convince people. You just take what happens at the bottom and you convince the top. That's why I'm talking about leaders with open ears. The reason why we have done no reform, and the reason for the examples that Panagiotis has mentioned, has to do with the fact that people at the top, spaghetti model systems, carbonara system, you name it, broken systems are systems that are unwilling to hear that reform is necessary. They don't want to hear people at the bottom. They don't want to hear that you want to move from Athens to Patras without having to look at the road signs, the yellow ones, reading that here accidents happen because the construction works are not over. But despite that, we went to Qatar 800 times in order to ensure investments for the Elliniko past airports. Yes, but shall we sell the previous airport and at the same time be deprived of decent roads in certain places of Greece? No, reforms move from the bottom to the top. We listen to simple citizens. Simple citizens want safety in transport and safe transfer. So product transport that is safe transfer for themselves, and savings that are secure. This is what they want. If you give them these three things, that is precisely what Ruth talked about before. The state is there only to safeguard rights. These three rights, in effect. If we manage to do this, then we got it over with. We need nothing more than that. Christine, if you don't mind. Let's... Okay, anyway, last question.
Of the Johns Hopkins School of International Studies, and I'm going to ask my question in English. Basically, it seems to me that the key ingredient that we're missing in Greece, and as Elena just brought up, is leadership. And where is this leadership going to come from? And from the example in Peru, there were these 50 businessmen and they worked together. However, in concert with the government and with the support of the government, similarly with Ruth Richardson, I'm sure you had the backing of your prime minister and your political party. How can you achieve that in Greece? No? How can you, where can this leadership come from in Greece and the political leadership to effect the necessary changes?
To be fair, I think that leadership requires three things. A willingness to take initiative. Our friend from Peru and his business sector were willing to take initiative. I was willing to go into the political arena and work with a party that had been part of the problem. So I had to be like an insurgent inside the party to win support for a program of change. It had started under a previous administration. My party had opposed it. I had to work from the inside, get a small team of believers in the inside. It's a willingness to take an initiative on the first hand. Secondly, you've got to have a coherent set of ideas that echoes, that resonates. So the ideas that we were initiating in the political realm resonated with the private sector, resonated with individuals who wanted more freedom. They felt stultified by the state. So that initiative has to be more widely embraced and argued for. And then, you have to make judgments. You know, in politics, you know, why are you there? You have your political capital, you can use it to good purpose or to bad. And so for political leaders in particular, they have to be willing to use their political capital to be game changers, knowing that while they in person may not remain in the political domain, the ideas do, and the ideas are cemented in and then built on. I think one of the problems, Eleanor talked about cynicism, one of the problems in the current climate is that politicians have lost their reputation. Mm-hmm. The politicians got us into this, how do we trust them to get out of this? And you know, I gave a lecture in New Zealand to some agricultural leaders this time last week, and we were talking about political leadership. And I said to so they're people of your age with your kind of education. I said, would any of you go into the political domain? And the answer was no. So I think we have to rehabilitate the, if you like, the profession of politics so that people of ideas who otherwise would innovate in the private sector are prepared for a time to use that power of leadership and innovation and change agency inside the political domain. So, you know, I spent a lot of my early career as somebody of your age. I was in politics in my 20s, made my big budget when I was in my 30s and out in my 40s. You know, you need to make politics be seen as a domain where, you know, people of real endeavour and real integrity can spend some time and help cement in the kind of reforms that are necessary.
With these words, I would like to thank you all very much and to say that we were just talking with Ruth and Gary. We are inspired by this, and you, Panayotis, I think, as well. I saw you smiling. Mainly because here at 7, I've started receiving so many questions over the internet. And lots of congratulations as well, which, you know, you usually get that on the TV or the radio, but it's very good to get that here. I would like to invite you to all come and act with us.